Welcome everybody to our series on the core JavaScript concepts. Now, if you're watching this, you might be working through CSX, which is CodeSmith's free online learning platform. Link above if you're interested. Or maybe you're just looking to get your hands dirty with some JavaScript. Either way, I'm super glad that you're here. We're going to be starting off with some basic concepts like functions and execution context, and then eventually we're going to move on to some harder stuff. We're going to get to recursion, we're going to talk about scope and closure, object-oriented programming, asynchronicity, all that stuff and more. And the purpose of this series is to break these concepts down together with some actual live coding to provide some context. So whether you're working through CSX or just wanting to acquaint yourself with some JavaScript, I'm sure there's something in here for you. Welcome. Let's get started. So today we are going to be talking about one of the earlier subjects in CSX, functions and execution context. Now, I highly recommend that you code along with us if you can, and also I want you to keep in mind you might need to watch this video more than once. Don't stress out if it doesn't make sense the first time through. If you're new to this, it might take some repetition for this stuff to finally click. This video in particular is meant to complement our hard parts lecture on functions and execution context, which you can also find on YouTube. And I recommend watching that either before or after this video because they work together really well to reinforce the same core ideas. So what is a function? A function is a reusable chunk of code that takes in an input, does some work, and then usually returns something out. And we give functions labels so that we can refer to them when we want to invoke them, when we want to use them. So that way we don't have to write out their logic every single time we want to perform that functionality. So I like to think of a toaster. A toaster, like a function, when I'm running it, it takes an input, so a piece of bread, does something with it, heats it up, and then returns something out, a piece of toast, right? And I can use that toaster with a bunch of different pieces of bread. It's not gonna be the same piece of bread over and over, right? I could use it with wheat, I could throw in a bagel, I could throw in English muffin, it's feeling like fall, I could throw in some pumpkin bread. I don't know, whatever. The point is you can reuse the function with different inputs and get different outputs. So let me show you what I mean here. Very basic example of a function. Let's just call this function, we'll say hi. And this function is, we won't give it an input yet. I just want to show you the very basics. So this function, this label for this function is say hi. And this is, like I said, it's got to return something. So it's going to return, just going to return the string hi. So I'm not invoking this function, I'm not running it, I'm just defining what it does, right? So when I want to invoke this function, like I said, I can just refer to it by its label, and then I tell JavaScript by using these parentheses, I say, okay, I want you to run this function. That's what the parentheses say. We're running the function, okay? And now if I click run code, it's running my code, but I can't see what it's doing right now unless I use my console.log tool, which this is a tool that it doesn't do anything to your code, it just shows you what your code is doing. It's a debugging tool. And so when I run my code, now I see hi, right? So I've got this function and its only job is to just return the string hi. Now, like I said, a function like a toaster can take inputs, right? So if I wanted to do that, I would pass it what's called a parameter. So let's say this is name, okay? I want this to say hi to a specific person. And so let's say hi, we'll give it a space plus name. So now when I invoke this function, I will pass an argument to the function called, we'll say Alex, the string Alex. So now when I invoke this function, name, this parameter is going to be this placeholder for the string Alex. So we get hi Alex, right? So now I can, like I said, I can reuse this function with a bunch of different inputs. I could call it again, and I could say, I want to say hi to Jane. And now name is going to be a placeholder. This parameter name is going to be a placeholder for whatever argument I pass in when I invoke the function, which in this case is now going to be Jane. So now I get the first time through, this is going to log hi Alex, then it's going to log hi Jane. So that's the basics of a function. We define this function, we give it a label, in this case say hi. This function is going to take in a parameter, which we're calling name. And then when we invoke the function, we are passing in our arguments, which get paired with the parameter when we invoke the function. So hi Alex, hi Jane. We're going to get back to functions in a second. I just wanted to give you an idea of what a function kind of is before we get started on execution context. Okay, so now we've got the basics of what a function is. Now let's talk about the thread of execution. So when we run our code, we start off in what's called the global execution context. And this is the global environment in which all of our code is being run. And each execution context has two things. It's got a thread of execution, so the order in which things are happening. JavaScript always runs line by line. And it also has its own memory. So the global execution context has its global memory. So there are technically two main steps to how our code runs. And I'm gonna oversimplify this just a little bit, but the first phase is the allocation phase. So JavaScript goes through our code and it's gonna store our functions and it's gonna allocate space for our variables like num, value1, and value2. That's phase one. Phase two is where our thread of execution comes in. So that is going to run line by line through our code, and if it hits a function, it's going to open up a new execution context, a local execution context, or a function level execution context. And that execution context is also going to have a thread of execution, and it's going to have its own memory, its own local memory. And so if the difference between those two phases is a little confusing, don't worry about it. The takeaway is that we have an execution context, and each execution context has that thread of execution and then also has its own memory. The global execution context has the global memory, a local execution context that would open up, say, from invoking add2 here on line 8, that's gonna get its local memory, okay? So let's pick this apart a little bit. So this is all our global execution context. We can think of all of this as our global execution context, and each execution context has a memory. So in our global memory, we are first going to store num and set its value to 3. We are going to store this function add2 in memory. We're not invoking it, we're just storing this function in memory so we can refer to it later when we want to use it. And then we hit line 8. Value is going to get set in global memory, but look at its value. This value is the evaluated result of invoking add2 and passing in 4. So whatever is returned from invoking this function, whatever's returned from this, that is what value1's value is going to be in memory. But in order to find that, we have to open up a local execution context. So a local execution context gets opened up. That execution context is going to have its own local memory. So first it's going to pair input number, the parameter input number, with whatever argument we passed in, which in this case is 4. So that gets saved in the local memory. And then we move down here and result is going to get saved in the local memory, and its value is going to be set to whatever the input number was, so in this case 4 plus 2. So result in the local memory now has a value of 6. And then this function, all it's got to do is return result. So it returns result out of this execution context and back into our global execution context, and now value1 is going to have a value of 6 in our global memory. And now our thread of execution is going to continue on down to line 9, where it's going to see, oh, value2, what do we assign its value to? That's going to be set to the evaluated result of invoking add2 and passing in 6. So a new execution context gets opened up. The thread of execution is going to weave into this execution context from our global execution context. And it's going to, we're going to first pair our parameter with our argument. So input number is going to get saved in this local execution context memory as 6. Then our thread of execution is going to see, oh, we've got result, and we are going to set its value in the local memory to whatever number was input, so 6 plus 2. So result gets a value of 8 in the local memory. And then we just return result. So result gets returned. We are done with this function. It's going to get garbage collected, and our thread of execution is going to weave out of it and back into our global execution context. And value2 now has a value of 8 in our global memory. And so now when I run this, I get, like I said, I'm going to have to console log my answers. So in order to see this, I could do console.log value. Here's a little trick I like to do, value1 colon, and then we can just put value1. And this just makes it a little easier to see what I'm doing. And then we can do the same for value2. We will just give this guy boop and boop. And now we have value1 is 6 and value2 is 8. The last thing I want to briefly mention is the call stack. So JavaScript doesn't have, this nice visual way of keeping track of where the thread of execution is and where it needs to go next. like we just did. It doesn't have these nice boxes, right, that we've been using. It uses what's called the call stack. The call stack is a stack of function calls. So whenever a function gets invoked, it gets added to the top of that call stack. It gets pushed to the top of the call stack. So when our thread of execution hits line 8, add2 gets invoked, so it's going to get pushed to the top of that call stack. Once it's done invoking that function, when our thread of execution steps out of that function, then add2 is going to get popped off the top of that call stack. And then JavaScript knows, okay, now the thread of execution needs to go back to the global execution context because that's what's left on the call stack. Then when our thread of execution gets to line 9 and invokes add2 again, well, that's gonna get pushed to the top of the call stack. So now our thread of execution is gonna step into that execution context. Once it's done invoking that function and doing its business, add2 is going to get popped off the top of the call stack. So then our thread of execution knows that it needs to go back to the global execution context. The more functions get called, the more they get added to the top of the call stack. So if add2 had a function, was invoking a function inside of it, we'll just call this new func, right? Let's say we had defined that somewhere. Then new func would get pushed to the top of the call stack. So when we invoke add2, it would add add2 to the call stack. It would push it onto the call stack. And then since add2 immediately invokes new func gets pushed to the top of the call stack. Then once new func is done executing, it's gonna get popped off the top of the call stack. The thread of execution knows that it can continue on with the rest of the add2 function. And then once add2 is done, that's gonna also get popped off the top of the call stack, and our thread of execution knows that it can go back into the global execution context. So the call stack is just JavaScript's way of keeping track of where the thread of execution is and where it needs to go next. All right, my friends, I hope that this brief rundown was helpful. Like I said, you might need to rewatch this a couple of times before it starts to click. Definitely make sure that you check out Codesmith's Hard Parts lecture on functions and execution context. It's a great resource, goes a little more in depth. And if you want to get started for free, check out CSX. That's Codesmith's online learning platform. It's a great place to get started with this stuff. You can find it at codesmith.io. Next time, we're going to move on to callbacks and higher order functions. So take some time with this, get a little more comfortable with it, and I will see you soon for more frolic and fun. Happy coding.